In the 1500s or around in there, people began to discover that the world was much bigger than they thought, and it was different in other places, and it began to arouse curiosity. And so the idea of exploration, investigation caught on at that time and began to blossom into what became modern science. But the people who founded modern science were pretty much Christian believers.
Para os pesquisadores pioneiros da investigação científica, a ciência, a teologia e a filosofia caminhavam de mãos dadas. Parece que havia um contexto cultural mais amplo do que existe hoje. E essa combinação dessas fontes de conhecimento distintas se complementam e acabam realmente permitindo o cientista ir mais longe.
Isaac Newton, Kepler, Boyle, Galileo, all these included God in their science. You can do very good science with God in the picture because the conclusion was that God created the laws of science.
In the matter of whether there's a conflict between faith and science, that wasn't their thinking. They were thinking God's thoughts after Him, and they were seeing how God does things. It wasn't a matter of is God doing that or not, but how is God doing it?
But then in the middle of the 19th century, science became so successful, they decided, hey, we don't need God in the picture anymore here. Pride took place of this, and science, strange as it may seem, excluded God out of the picture.
La gran controversia entre ciencia y religión no siempre existió. Años atrás parecía claro el lugar que cada una ocupaba en el amplio, aunque muchas veces limitado conocimiento humano. Hoy, por el contrario, hay momentos en los que parece que no existe un punto de reconciliación. ¿Pero será que son realmente excluyentes como muchos proponen? ¿O será que pueden trabajar juntas para lograr un aporte aún mayor al desarrollo no solo del conocimiento, sino del ser humano como un todo?
El contraste entre lo que el ser humano considera como solo razón frente a aquello que no tiene posibilidades de ser percibido de forma material existe desde la antigüedad. O sea, ya desde la tensión entre los religiosos de Grecia que creían en mitos, en dioses, que por cierto eran caprichosos y casi siempre el ser humano acababa mal en ese tipo de relación, frente al filósofo que se cuestionaba elementos como de dónde vengo, cuál es mi existencia, qué soy, hacia dónde va el mundo, ha existido siempre. Esa tensión siempre ha existido, sobre todo en el Mediterráneo, en las zonas de cultura que podemos decir greco-romana.
It goes way back, of course. The Greeks, some of the Greeks believed in basically evolution, and but let's just talk about our more modern environment. It started a lot back at the time of the Enlightenment, and on and beyond that, there began to be a more of a doubting of the Bible. I mean, before that, most people just believed that there was God and the Bible was trustworthy, at least in the, in the Western world. But there are several things that came together, it seems. One is, through the Middle Ages, there was a lot of abuse of power and authority by both the church and the state. And a lot of people were just held down. They could not advance in any way and being able to think for themselves. And there was a growing weariness of all of that. People wanted to be able to think for themselves and be able to learn and escape these low-class status. You couldn't make any money. You couldn't. You just had to be poor and accept whatever anybody told you. They wanted to be able to improve, and so there began to be more distrust of any kind of authority, including the Bible.
Empieza a haber una serie de preguntas y dudas acerca de esta cosmovisión cristiana. Se empieza a concebir que la razón humana es lo más importante y que los credos y las religiones y la Biblia no merecen tanta confianza. De modo que se fue empujando lentamente en la cultura a Dios del escenario y empezó a entrar cada vez con más fuerza la presencia de la mente humana, de su capacidad de investigar, de conocer, de explicar, de definir.
Pero cuando el ojo del hombre se centra en el hombre, por más amplias que sean sus fronteras, mayor será su ceguera, y en sus intentos por ignorar lo ineludible, acabará olvidando también lo inteligible, y así fallando en el mismo principio de la tal denominada ciencia.
Ese es un tema de una época de grandes cambios. Se va a producir la revolución industrial, se va a producir movimientos de crecimiento en América, se habían producido movimientos de independencia en las colonias. Son tiempos de muchos cambios que aportan cierta libertad, por un lado, y por el otro hay mucha necesidad, mucha ganas de investigar, ¿no? El enciclopedismo francés hace que luego va a llegar hasta Inglaterra, hace que la gente quiera viajar, conocer sitios, hacerse preguntas, ¿no? Cuando llegan a nuevos pueblos se preguntan, ¿estos seres qué son? ¿Son como nosotros? ¿Son menos que nosotros? ¿Dónde se encuentran estos animales, no? De ahí que el viaje de Darwin y la llegada a las Islas Galápagos a él le rompe todo, porque si todo era fijista y se encuentra en una población tan pequeña, tantos cambios, sobre todo en pájaros, ¿no? En aves, como se producían en las Islas Galápagos, tan radicales, él hace abrir la mente, entonces llega a conclusiones erróneas a nuestra manera de ver, pero comprensibles en el momento histórico del pensamiento en el que está, ¿no?
Darwin's motivation was theological, because he had taken the theological course, and he was bothered by the evil that he saw in nature, what he considered evil at least, and I think many people would agree with him, of parasites and violence and so on. And so Darwin couldn't accept the idea that there was some kind of beneficent God who was doing these things. And so he developed his theory that this was natural selection was driving this, nothing to do with God. And that kind of encouraged people who wanted to be away from God to push God farther away.
In this process, theories like evolution began to develop. And of course, Darwin wasn't the first one. The idea of evolution was in the air for at least 100 years or more before him. But by the time of Darwin, this had become very prominent. And so that made it possible for his theory to become accepted.
Una idea que casi ni se quería publicar y que resultaba un tanto extraña, se va a llegar a imponer casi como el paladín de la ciencia frente a la religión. Hemos de pensar que poco tiempo después de Darwin y los movimientos que se van a producir en el siglo XIX, llega la modernidad. La modernidad estaba basada en el positivismo, el ser humano puede llegar a cualquier parte del conocimiento, puede controlar la naturaleza, con esfuerzo puede llegar a saber cómo funcionan todas las cosas, Y esa mentalidad que tiene toda la estructura de una religión se oponía a la sumisión que expresaban las religiones. La religión decía, bueno, tienes que dejarte llevar, lo que te diga tal o tal autoridad. Entonces esa tensión es fuerte, ¿no? Se desgaja, hace que se desgaje una mentalidad de otra.
Tensión que se vuelve coerción, conflicto que aunque evitable se polariza mientras el hombre insiste en adoctrinar a través de algo que no es más que un método, en colocar verdades únicas y definitivas como resultado de un proceso cuyo objetivo en realidad es muy diferente.
O método científico não está atrelado nem ao teísmo, nem ao ateísmo. O método é neutro, por definição. Então, ele está acessível a qualquer pessoa, independente da sua religião, da sua cosmovisão. Muito embora seja um método desenvolvido pela própria mente humana, que não é neutra, é tendenciosa, um método, em essência, por definição, ele é neutro. Então, cientistas bons poderão realmente fazer trabalhos fantásticos, independente da sua religião, seja um ateu, seja um cristão, seja um agnóstico, seja um batista, seja um islâmico, todos podem fazer boa ciência. A mente humana racional permite essa interação com os sistemas ordenados da natureza, sem nenhum problema. Agora, quando vamos para as origens, aí os problemas começam a acontecer.
Quando tratamos sobre o origen foi um único evento, no se puede repetir. El origen o los orígenes del universo, de los seres, de la vida, no se puede medir. El origen o los orígenes no pueden tener un resultado previo, no podemos prevenir. Y con este conocimiento de los orígenes no podemos formar leyes, no más leyes. Entonces, cuando se trata de los orígenes, no es un campo que la ciencia debe tratar.
Science doesn't make any claims of being inspired or being everything is true. Science is always a human activity. Some of it is trustworthy, some of it isn't. Most of it's going to change through time, and so we need to learn how to think about science, how to evaluate it, how to ask questions, so that we have a good means of deciding what we can trust and what we don't.
No estudo da natureza, estudo científico da natureza, os fatos da natureza podem ser interpretados ou sob o ponto de vista de que todas as coisas acontecem por acaso, têm acontecido desde o início do universo, ou então o outro ponto de vista de que há um planejador, há um planejamento e, portanto, as coisas que nos cercam na própria natureza, elas têm sempre um propósito, um desígnio, um planejamento em torno delas. Então, veja que não há um conflito verdadeiramente entre ciência e religião. Nós entendemos que o conflito é entre esses dois pontos de vista distintos para a interpretação dos fatos observados na natureza.
The problem is that we get science as a philosophy and science as a method mixed up. Science as a method is not a problem at all. We as Adventists, as Christians, we all use science. We can use science as a method. But what's happened in the world is that science as a method has been converted to science as a philosophy.
All the scientists have the same scientific data. We all have the same fossils. We all have the same layers of rock. We all have the same radioactive data. Where the conflict is, it's a conflict between two philosophies. One philosophy that says there is no God and that everything happened by faith and chance, or by chance natural processes. The other says that there's a very good God who created all things, and yet sin came into the world, and as a result, the world was cursed. Eventually the flood came, and so on. And so it's a conflict between two philosophies, not a conflict between faith and science.
It's a conflict between theism as a basis for studying nature and materialism as a basis for studying nature. And of course, materialism and theism are opposing ideas. They are not compatible. So the practice of science as a materialist philosophy and the practice of science as an investigation of God's handiwork in nature, obviously there's going to be conflict. It doesn't need to be there, but it's because of the philosophical context in which the discussion is going on that we have this apparent conflict.
Incompleta, provisoria, siempre sujeta a la revisión. Así percibe a la ciencia el científico mientras recorre su camino en busca de la verdad, humillándose ante lo que no conoce, maravillándose con aquello que apenas alcanza a comprender, obteniendo muchas veces más preguntas que respuestas y debiendo decidir una y otra vez a qué llamar realidad, verdad, razón e incluso fe.
The question is really, what should we do with that tension? I personally see it as a very useful thing. I do believe that our empirical senses are helpful in helping us to understand what's happening around us. And I do believe that the Bible provides us with accurate information about what has happened in the past, why we're here, and what will happen in the future as well. So when there is some tension between those two things, it tells me there's something I don't fully understand.
Some people would argue that religious views and science need to be separated, that the two have no interaction at all. But in fact, the Bible can be used to ask some very important questions. So we have a hypothesis in the Bible that God created. We have a hypothesis in the Bible that God destroyed the earth by the flood. And so we can use those accounts to ask questions on the rocks, to ask questions about the fossils, to ask questions about the scientific data. And we have, I think, because we've been able to ask those kinds of questions, come up with better explanations.
I find that it's useful when I look at a problem to try to think of all the different sources of information that are available to try to help solve the problem. So in science, if I'm trying to solve a problem, I go to the literature, I talk to friends about their ideas, I do some of my own personal experiments and so forth, so I put all of that together. But then in the bigger picture, as I'm looking at nature, I'm interested in the scientific literature, I'm interested in what people in the past have said about it, but I also have a great deal of respect for the Bible and feel like it has something unique that can help inform my research. And I find that there are a number of areas of science that science within itself demonstrates that it's not sufficient to answer all the questions.
As a scientist, I find that my science tells me there has to be a designer. It's not blind faith. When I look at a cell, I see all these complex enzymes, all these complex genes, all these different activities going on inside the cell. And the picture is becoming so much more complex. DNA, you know, we have genes, now we have epigenetics, that's making the picture much more. I don't have the faith to think that happened just by itself. No, there has to be a designer. This is reason, this is science that is telling me, no, there has to be a God.
The concepts of intelligent design are really important concepts for us as educators and science teachers to understand and share with our students. As you look at the way the genes work to make up a single cell and the impossibility of that evolving, you have to say to yourself, this has a design, it even has a design process. There must be a designer. It's not possible that something looks as though it's designed, but isn't designed. And so while we can't impose our story on a postmodern world, we can at least raise the questions.
Existen preguntas que son mucho más que el reconocimiento de la ignorancia. Son el mismo origen del razonamiento. Pensar, investigar, buscar respuestas será siempre insuficiente si no se formulan las preguntas correctas. Libres, imparciales, originadas desde la sincera curiosidad del ser humano que busca sobre todas las cosas encontrar la verdad.
Number of ways in which my faith gives me this advantage of being more open-minded and seeing things that others don't see. And I could give a specific example. When we were studying fossil whales in Peru, there are other scientists, other paleontologists had studied those for 20 years. And yet none of them noticed that the very slow accumulation of the sediments that was assumed was not compatible with well-preserved whales. If you don't bury them quickly, they're not going to be well-preserved. But they had not noticed this, at least not enough to write anything about it. When we got there, we immediately saw there was a problem. You can't have very slow sedimentation of depositing a few centimeters of sediments per 1,000 years and have well-preserved whales. There's just no way. And so we noticed that immediately, and we realized there's more research that is needed. And so we studied this and found the conclusions that we did, which others could have, but why didn't they? Because they are so sure they know that this has been millions of years that they just don't notice the problem. Whereas our faith helped us to see it right away.
I can give you one example of how this has played out in my own experience. It had to do with a series of fossil forests that lay one above another in an area in the United States up in the northern part in Wyoming. And these fossil forests each had upright trees. So there was layer after layer after layer with upright trees. And so standard conventional geologists just assume this took many hundreds of thousands of years to make all these forests and all these trees. And that was all the farther they went in their research. Whereas we came at this problem and we said, I don't think this took thousands of years. I think this happened very quickly. So we began to explore the possibilities, and we thought about various ways that these trees could have been transported there and deposited upright and buried in this volcanic material very quickly. So we had options to consider that the conventional geologists didn't. And as we began to study this, we found more and more that the data didn't support the idea that they grew there. The data suggested that they were brought in very quickly and buried in some kind of catastrophic process. At that point in our study, we had published these results in the scientific literature. And at that point in our study, a great catastrophe happened.
We are directly over Mount St. Helens right now, and there is no question at all that the volcanic activity has begun. You can see smoke and ash pouring from the top of the mountain, especially on the north side of the mountain.
And Mount St. Helens, the giant volcano, blew up, and it created a huge explosion, and it destroyed thousands and thousands of acres of trees, just blew them over flat. And after that, these trees were washed into a lake, and they began to float upright, and then they began to settle to the bottom of the lake where they would have been buried by another eruption. So we realized this is a model of how these ancient forests were deposited. They aren't forests at all. They are levels with trees in them that have been deposited catastrophically in very short time. So this was an example. It actually changed the national park. At Yellowstone National Park, they took down their signs that called these ancient forests, and the National Geographic magazine made a map that showed these areas as catastrophic forests. So we had actually not only seen a better way of interpreting these forests, but we also had an impact on what other people were going to see there in the future.
Desde el principio el ser humano ha disfrutado del contacto con la naturaleza, sea utilizándola como un medio de vida, de recreación o incluso como una fuente abundante de conocimiento. Y en su insaciable curiosidad, el hombre siempre anda en búsqueda de respuestas, sean estas simples o tal vez complejas, superficiales sobre algún asunto o fundamentales, en cuanto pueden cambiar completamente la forma en la que se concibe a sí mismo y al mundo.